you very much for the introduction. Just to tell you a little bit more about all that. So I did come into supercomputing as a physicist. My undergrad and my PhD were in physics. I realized during my PhD doing simulations that the bit I really liked about my PhD, rather than plotting lots of radial distribution functions and analyzing those, was writing the software to produce those in the first place. And that's kind of where my passion comes from for improving HPC for scientists, because I think a lot of scientists are self-taught programmers, because, you know, they specialize in something else. And that kind of ties in with why diversity is important. Because if you have a group of people who are self-taught, there's so many barriers to partaking in the HPC community in the first place. If we add an additional barrier to do with an underrepresented groups, it is so much harder to participate. I know I'm all about making, this is very, very cliche, but making the world a better place by using HPC to solve lots of human challenges. I always say when I go out and do outreach talks to schoolgirls, mainly schoolgirls, because I'm all about getting the girls interested in science. I do talk to boys too. I'm like, this is not about using the fastest machines in the world, although actually that's kind of awesome, but it's about making the world a better place. That's the reason I get up in the morning. And that's exactly why I set up Women in HPC. So Women in HPC started with this question. Coming from a physics background, I moved to a supercomputing center, and I looked around and I thought, gosh, this is actually really good. I was the only woman in my research group in my physics department at the time when I was doing my PhD. There were other women around in the physics department, but just not in my group. And so moving to a supercomputing center where we had 25% women at the time I started, I was like, wow, this is amazing. This is so much better than physics. Fantastic. I'm in the right area. What can physics do to learn from that? Because I was still heavily involved in physics at that point as well. And I worked with the physics department that I did my PhD in. While I was working in the supercomputing center, I worked with them on diversity initiatives. And then I started working on international collaborations, particularly European ones. And I'd go to a project meeting, and I'd be the only woman in the room. And this kept happening. And I wondered, how many women are there in high-performance computing? And then I realized that nobody knew. We have a really, really good understanding now, certainly in the UK, but even internationally, of physics, chemistry, computer science, technology. People are looking at this and actively looking at the diversity, particularly gender diversity of these fields. Traditional subject areas is what I refer to them as. High-performance computing has sort of gone, oh, well, everybody else is looking at that. We work with all these groups, we're fine. My experience working on international projects, anecdotally, was we are not fine. So I realized if nobody's counting, we need to start doing that. Which led me to set up Women in HPC. Because the first thing you've got to do is count. If you don't count, you don't know what you're doing. More to the point, if you don't count, if you then implement initiatives to improve the situation, you have no idea whether what you're doing is good, neutral, or indeed, as has sometimes happened, actually has a negative impact in broadening participation. So I broke it down into three things. How many women are there? How can we improve the proportion of women? And how can we then retain the diversity in the community? So the retention is a really big one, because a lot of the time, we have no idea where the women are and whether or not it's all down to us or not. So to start off, what do we know so far? So I've done a little bit of counting. We started in 2013 with our official launch in 2014, so it's very new. And you wouldn't believe how hard it is to actually figure out how many women there are. Because unless you work in a supercomputing center, you don't have in a physics department or in a big company, you don't have an HPC group necessarily. It's very unusual anyway. So yeah, 25% in my group was very good. But is that reflective of the entire HPC user community? So what have we found out so far? The absolute upper limit I'm seeing is 20%. Absolute upper limit, that's an optimistic upper end. Supercomputing, I guess most of you have heard of the Supercomputing Conference. They're looking at 13% of attendees being female. They've only started counting recently, and the methodology for counting One of the things I'm particularly interested in changing and actually getting it to be self-declared, because that's at the moment it's doing an analysis of names, which we know is inherently, it's okay as an aggregate, but there are issues with that. But 13%, and I should point out, that is everybody who attends supercomputing and registers. And one of the questions we are looking at answering is, are there more women on the exhibit hall floor compared to the tech program? Exactly. But we don't jump to conclusions, we need evidence, right? But this is certainly what we're thinking. So this number, this 13%, could be an awful lot lower when you remove the exhibit hall floor only attendees. And I'm sure some of you who've walked around the exhibit hall floor have experienced the, if you're a female that is, and there are a lot of women in this room, you've experienced the, oh, it's all right, dear, I'll talk to your male colleague instead, right? How many of us have experienced that? Yeah, everybody, pretty much. And it's so disheartening. But the other thing, when you look at other conferences, the more niche, if that's the word that I'm looking for, the more niche you go, like PGAS. The PGAS 2013 conference was run in Edinburgh. So being in Edinburgh, I kind of got in there and decided to take a good strong look at it. 5% of the attendees were women. More disconcerting than that is when you actually looked at who was attending, the majority, all but one of that 5%, all but one person was from the local host institution, i.e. EPCC, where I work. And we know now that 25% is unusually high. As PRACE Days, which is a pan-European conference, who's heard of PRACE? No, okay, so PRACE is the Pan-European Supercomputing Initiative. It works with most of the supercomputing centers and many universities across Europe, provides pan-European HPC services to scientists. They have an annual industry and bringing industry and academia together conference every year. And then, so they get quite a lot of industry engagement. So the 17% there is probably the highest participation in a conference I've seen in the world so far. So how does that compare to what we definitely know about the traditional subjects that I've already mentioned? Because at the end of the day, although we're now HPC is now broadening out to include humanities, we are still very dominated by computer science, physics, and chemistry, a little bit of biology. Those are the majority of the people that come into our field. So this is representative pretty much of an international picture, but it's actually the UK higher education qualification data. So these are with people graduating in degrees in the UK, first degrees in the UK. Physics and astronomy, 17% of graduates are women. It rises, the highest is biological sciences, where we get 45%, but 17 is the lowest, which is pretty much the upper limit we were seeing in our conference attendance. So the classic of, this is not our problem, I don't believe is true, because we're not doing as well as our feeding in subjects. To give you another little picture, this is the MPI Forum, the standards body that put together MPI every single year. Well, they meet 4 times a year. They came to Edinburgh last summer because we were running the Euro MPI conference. And this is, I don't know how well you can see that, but this is a picture taken of who came. What I will tell you about the MPI Forum is that there are only 3 regular female attendees. That's about 8%. It was as low as 1 a female attendee a couple of years ago. These are the people who are deciding the future of message passing, the thing that basically the majority of HPC codes use. And women are not included in that conversation. So what do we know about the broader community? This is tech community participation. Technology is a very broad-ranging definition, I know, but it's a good place to start when we look beyond just academia. So in the US, you're doing incredibly well. 25% is pretty much the highest of the, oh, hello, I put my prompts the wrong way around. In Europe, it's 16%. And in the UK, 17%. The most concerning thing about the UK and the European numbers is that women's participation in the IT workforce in the UK and Europe has remained stagnant for a decade, actually more than a decade, since 2004. We are not improving. Now, I should point out that there's a slight caveat to that, which is that the number of people in the community is increasing. So the actual number of women is increasing, but it's only keeping up with the new numbers of men coming in. We're not increasing the number of women working in the tech sector in the UK and Europe. So the US, you should be patting yourselves on the back. You're doing really, really well. On the other hand, that 25% is a lot higher than what we're seeing at the supercomputing conference, where I think 70% of attendees are from the US. So the opportunity. Why do we care about diversity? Now, you are actually the wrong audience for this, because you came to my talk voluntarily. Nobody, well, maybe with one exception, nobody was bludgeoned coming to the talk today. Nobody was like, you must go, I assume, anyway. So I'm assuming everybody in this room basically thinks diversity is a good idea. I will tell you now, there are people who do not take that view. They are few and far between, and we're getting the message across that it is important, but there are still plenty of people who need a bit of convincing about why we need to improve diversity. So I'll just give a few key pointers here, just in case you don't know them. We have a huge workforce shortfall in computer science related topics, of which HPC is an ever increasing part of, right? We're taking over the world. Parallel programming, I know that's not HPC, but parallel programming methodologies need to be used in your laptop now. You can even use them on your phone. So we are taking over the world, whether we want to or not. So 90% increase in US computer science related workforce is predicted by 2024. That's huge numbers of people. Similar, Europe, Canada. Europe needs 756 IT sector jobs by 2020. Canada is 182,000. Wherever you look, technology is taking over the planet, right? And HPC is going to be in a continuing part of that. If you are excluding 51% of your potential workforce, because 51% of the human population is female, if you're excluding them simply because they don't feel they can participate, how are you ever going to meet that? So that's number one, addressing the workforce shortfall. The other thing we know is diverse teams improve team IQ. We know that team IQ can outperform the best IQ of an individual in a team, and the more diverse your team is, provided it functions correctly, you increase team IQ, your problem-solving ability, your innovation, your ideas creation, looking at things a bit differently. This all comes down to when you're all the same, which is what we like to see when we hire people. You're like me, I feel comfortable with you, I'm going to appoint you, right? It's the thing we all look for. But when we're all the same, we don't challenge each other. We don't think differently, we think the same, and therefore we're not going to consider all the different options on the table. There's also some interesting studies about improved citation rates for patents. There's possibly evidence of improved citation rates in actual academic papers as well. That's less concrete. But diversity is just a good thing from this information, right? We're going to solve so many more problems if we improve diversity. Mm-hmm.
So there are clear explanations as to why there's an improved citation rate?
I don't think so, but I know that you want to keep questions until the end.
Oh.
So is that, but we can come back to that. I don't know if anything's, I don't know off the top of my head on that one. I can talk about Team IQ though. So just to give you an example of whether or not this is actually a problem as far as the community perceives it. We put out a community survey internationally in 2016. And one of the questions we asked is, do you believe that a gender-balanced international HPC community has a positive, neutral or negative effect? And you can see here, overwhelmingly, male and female responders to this survey believe it has a positive effect, which is really great news. Actually, the number of people we need to be convincing that diversity is a good thing is relatively small, but it is not insignificant. And interestingly, there are still more men than women, not very many more, thankfully, who believe that there is no effect in improving diversity. So the challenge, what is the challenge here? The first one is to address the age-old thing of it's not our problem. The problem's down to schools. The pipeline was leaky all the way up. It's not our problem. We can't influence diversity. It's elsewhere. It's in schools. It's in undergraduate degrees. They don't apply to us at all. We can just do with we can deal with the people that are here right now. I would say, given the information I showed you earlier about how many women there are in HPC compared to our traditional feeding in subjects, it is our problem. The other thing is we also have a huge potential to impact schooling in outreach programs. If you talk to teenage girls about doing computer science or technology-related jobs, they are completely uninterested. As soon as you point out to them, and there are multiple studies that have done this, as soon as you point out to them that they have an influence on society, it pays a decent wage, it doesn't need to be a great wage, but pays a decent wage, and you put them in front of somebody who looks like them, probably therefore female, their interest level goes sky high. We are not doing a good enough job to educate our teenage girls about what we can do with science. And more importantly, what HPC can do, right? As I said earlier, I'm here to change the world. That sounds incredibly cliche, but at the end of the day, what we do has an impact on every single human being. And that message needs to come across. It's not sufficient to just talk about coding and to just talk about the fastest machines in the world. That only deals with a small subset of potential people who could come into this. And I should point out, when you talk like this, it doesn't just improve things for women, you actually reach a whole load of men, well, boys at this point, as well, that aren't otherwise interested. So we can influence education by going out there, sharing with the rest of the planet what we do. Why pay lots of taxpayers' money to us? Because we're making the world a better place. It's all about creating that impact statement that we will now have to do anyway to get funding in. We now need to turn that into something that we can communicate with the wider population. And then the other big one is recruitment. Why does a physics PhD student decide to come into HPC, or more importantly, why do they not decide to? What is it that we can do to make this sector more appealing? And then the third one is retention, which I'll come to in a few minutes. The problem, at least in IT more broadly, as I said, we are still just scraping the surface to understand the picture for HPC. So I take a lot of data from IT and the STEM subjects more generally. In 1985, 30% of bachelor degrees in the US were awarded to women in computer science degrees. In 2008, that dropped to 18%. In 1991, 36% of professional IT-related jobs were held by women. In 2008, that dropped to 57%. This, for a long time, I heard a lot of my colleagues tell me that, oh, Eastern Europe doesn't have this problem. They have lots of women. And then it was seen that actually Eastern Europe, they were having a declining proportion of women. Until NC did this study, actually, we didn't realize it applies to the US as well, and it probably applies to the UK. There are lots of hypotheses for why this has happened, to do with in the 1980s, computer games came into the home. Computer games were aimed at boys, not girls. And so you had this huge change in the 1980s onwards. Basically, my generation onwards, we weren't exposed as young women to the idea that computing was a fun thing to do. In the 1960s, women were computers. If anybody's seen Hidden Figures, you will, the movie, if you haven't, go and watch it tonight. But you will know that women were computers before we had computers. And actually, women were the first people to do programming and stuff like that. And that has all changed in the last 30 years. The workforce is leaky. At 10 years into a career, 41% of women leave the IT sector compared to only 17% of their male colleagues. So we have a retention problem for both genders, but it is worse for women. At the midpoint, 56% of women have left the IT sector. 49% go on to use their skills somewhere else, take that skill to another sector, but 51% abandon their training entirely. They don't use those skills going forwards in their career. Now, this is the IT workforce. I know I'm taking a leap here to say this applies to us. It's very likely to apply to us. We do need to understand it. If this is what's happening to us as well, our retention problem is probably our number one biggest issue. How do we retain our diverse workforce? So in the community survey, the other highlight to me was when we asked the question, we asked people to agree or disagree to a statement. I have never experienced discrimination by colleagues. The eye-opener here being, I've got that the wrong way around. No, I haven't got that the wrong way around. I have got that the wrong way around. Sorry, these labels should be the other way around. So women were, oh no, I never experienced discrimination by colleagues. You can tell I wrote these slides on the plane ride yesterday, can't you? I apologize. 4.15 was the average score for men. So men were far less likely to report experiencing discrimination than women. So we know that, okay, you can argue about what discrimination is, but certainly in the UK legal context, discrimination is whether or not you personally perceive you have been discriminated against. Because a lot of the time, otherwise it's incredibly difficult to prove. It's all arbitrary. Have I been discriminated against? Have I not? How you then go and redress that is when it gets really complicated. But perception is number one here. And women are far more likely to think they have experienced discrimination. So it's here every single day. And this is going to be impacting our attention. I feel that colleagues in my workplace are treated equally by each other regardless of gender. Here, interestingly, although men score slightly higher, so they're more likely to agree that everybody's treated equally in their workforce, it's very similar. So, okay, it's not down at like 1 or 2, which I'm really glad about. It's not like all the women are saying, I don't think anybody in my workforce is treated equally. But what we are seeing is that, they're not up at 4.5. There are a significant proportion of people who answered this survey who say they are experiencing, that they think that their workforce is not treated equally regardless of gender. Some of the quotes we had are things such as, I sometimes get the impression that professionalism is rather narrowly defined as behave like the stereotypical white man. My department has a weekly meeting on the topic of cosmology. One week, I brought a cosmology paper I wanted to discuss. Right after I mentioned this, a male postdoc in the group said that he wanted to discuss a paper that was not about cosmology and was therefore off topic for the meeting. We discussed that paper instead of the one I wanted. I felt that my suggestion was not taken seriously. Was it because of my sex, my junior status, or something else? I don't know. Crucially, I haven't attended that meeting since then. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff going on in that statement, but that final sentence should just be this huge warning flare to us. I haven't attended that meeting since then. What's going to happen to that person going forwards? I'm feeling that my personal professional progression is impeded by not granting permission to travel more, visit collaborators, publish publications, etc., when other colleagues have these opportunities. I'll leave that one for you to decide what you think of it. So, the opportunity. We need to, as I keep saying, address recruitment and retention. These two things together are the only way we're going to bring about diversity. It is not sufficient to say it's not our problem at schools. It's not sufficient to only look at recruitment. And a lot of our initiatives really do only just consider recruitment. We need to look at retention. We need to figure out why women, I'm focusing on gender here, but it's more than just gender diversity, why these groups do not feel that they want to stay in our workforce and contribute to our workforce. So some of the stuff I've done with women in HPC, we've done a couple of case studies, and a couple of years ago, 2015, I worked with the International HPC Summer School, which interestingly is coming to Boulder this summer, and they're hopefully visiting NCAR, so fingers crossed you impressed a lot of them here. Anyway, the summer school is a collaboration between Prace, Exceed, Riken in Japan, and Compute Canada. And it brings, I think, 50 or 60 students somewhere every year, either in Europe or the US, or sometimes it's gone to Canada as well, together with about 30 staff members. The staff members are from institutions like Edinburgh Parallel Computing Centre, HPC experts. We go and we train them for a week. It's incredibly intense. If you have this on your CV, it is a killer thing to have in your CV. It's incredibly prestigious. Everything is funded. So the application process is crucial to making sure that we are giving everybody the opportunity they deserve. So one of the things we did is a colleague of mine, Lorna Rivera, who's now at Georgia Tech, who's part of Exceed, and we looked at the way applicants were scored. And also, all the successful applicants are asked to complete a pre-survey. Now, a crucial thing about the pre-survey is entirely self-documenting. They're asked questions like, what's your familiarity with MPI? What's your familiarity with CUDA? And we ask them to self-rate. That self-rating is used to then stream them at the summer school into the introductory or the advanced tracks. So how they answer this survey has an impact on what they learn in the summer school. We also do a survey of the reviewers, and because of what we found, which I'll explain in a minute, what we found in the whole gamut of things, we did an on-site attendee mini test. The first thing they did after they met everybody was they did a mini test about HPC concepts. There's a whole white paper out there on this, but just to give you a few nice little pointers, we found that consistently the male applicants were rated significantly higher than the female applicants. The pre-survey, the self-rating of the successful candidates in the or actually, did I have a quote? I didn't have a quote then. The successful candidates in the attendee pre-survey, 55% of the self-report knowledge and experience scale, where we asked them to self-rate as novice to expert, right? Novice and expert. We found that the men rated themselves significantly higher than women. So we were then using that to put women more likely. In fact, I think 1 year before we did this study, there were no women in the advanced track, which is why we looked at this. None of the 7 self-report frequency scales, where we asked you, instead of asking, are you an expert or novice, we said, how often do you use MPI? Weekly, monthly, daily, how often, right? We know that's not a perfect way of doing it, but unless you're going to actually say, do you know what a collective operation is? Do you know what non-blocking communications are? Unless you go into that kind of detail, how do you quickly get this information out of them? But when we used a frequency scale, items demonstrated no gender differences. So what did we do? We did, to understand whether or not there really was a difference here in the male and female attendees, the ones that were successful, because both the reviewers and the self-reporting was indicating, I should say, that women were apparently less able. We did a direct assessment of the attendees. We found no significant gender difference when we did that. The reviewers, male and female, I should point out, were asked to give feedback on the applications. And this is one of the quotes, for example. Unfortunately, the pool of female applicants was so small and maximally qualified. Females did not appear to come up to the level of maximally qualified males. I worry if the difference in preparation between males and females will be visible to the students at the event, and if so, whether it will have a negative reinforcing effect on the minority position of the women in HPC. We found that when we asked questions that had anything to do with gender in the reviewer feedback, they were always scored lower. So question E was, do you agree or disagree to the applicant struck me as equally qualified regardless of gender? But question G, which has nothing to do with gender, was scored higher. I feel confident about the decisions I made. We found these are just representative questions, there were a lot of questions. Every single question that had something to do with gender, the reviewers answered on average lower. There's a lot more work to be done to understand that, I know. And one of the reasons why we actually took this forward is there has been discussion amongst the staff for years that the women are less able when they attend. What we were able to prove is that it's a perception that is probably within the era of a short study at the beginning of the actual summer school, a quiz, but we have repeated that for the last 2 years. Yeah, we did a quiz in 2015, 2016, we're doing it again this year. We have found that we are still seeing that there is no difference when they actually turn up. But even the staff were thinking that the attendees were different. And that's going to impact on how they were treated. Another quote, I don't think we deliberately treat women differently, but I think it's very easy for us to implicitly assume that a decent female student will take a more applied path while we force her male colleagues to start programming. The interesting thing here, this assumption that women are coming from more applied routes, we actually found was not correct. 47%, I think it's 47%, of the Exceed applicants, 47% of the computer science Exceed applicants were women. So there's no difference there. Plenty of women are coming from computer science backgrounds. Reviews are now double blind. So the reviewers are not seeing gender or names. The assessments are continuing every single year. And the key thing that we've done here is we've changed how the staff are behaving. The staff no longer believe there's a gender difference. And I think that has the potential to have the single biggest impact, because as I'll mention shortly, unconscious bias starts kicking in as soon as we think there is a difference. And unconscious bias is probably the single most powerful thing that can change how we treat each other in the workplace. The pre-assessment no longer uses ratings such as novice and expert. It's all down to frequency. We keep tweaking the words here to try and see if we can come up with a better way of doing it. But it is supposed to just give us a starting point anyway. It's not supposed to be absolutely perfect. In an ideal world, we'd ask them, do you know about this, this, and this, and this? Have you ever programmed in CUDA? Have you, do you know what a kernel is and stuff like this? But we don't. We don't have the time. That's not the purpose of this. But we are continually tweaking this to see if we can improve how this self-assessment is done. So another example are some of the innovations that you can bring about. As part of the ARCHER service, so ARCHER is the national supercomputing facility in the UK, which Edinburgh runs, and I'm part of the team that runs that. We provide training. We split the training into roughly 3 levels, introductory courses. These are really, really introductory. We take people who don't even know how to use the command line and we sit them down and we get them to log in and submit a job. There's no coding. We handhold them the entire way. So there's introductory level courses. Intermediate level courses, so introductions to MPI, OpenMP, CUDA, stuff like this. Really designed for scientists who want to program in parallel, but they don't know much about. They know how to program, but that's as far as it goes. And then the more advanced courses are hybrid programming vectorization for Xeon Phis and things like that. And what we found is that women, the highest proportion of female attendees was in the lowest level courses. Women were coming at 28% to level 1 courses, but by the time you get to hybrid programming, you're down at 11%. So there's a drop off there. We were the first group to break it down like this and actually to see that we're replicating what we're seeing in conferences. So supercomputing gets 13% female attendees, but it was an incredibly broad conference. It covers every aspect of HPC and data almost, and machine learning and stuff like this. PGAS, 5%. So we're seeing here what we were seeing in conferences. So what do we do? Well, women in HPC decided, right, we're going to run some training. Now, I will admit, as a trainer, I'm one of the people that goes and does training, I was uncomfortable about this. Until I set out women in HPC, I didn't want to be called a woman in HPC. I was uncomfortable about doing this, but we thought we'd give it a go. There were plenty of other people who said, no, that's horrible. Why would you do that? But the results were quite interesting. It was led entirely by female instructors, people like me and some of my colleagues. And as far as possible, all the helpers were also female. We didn't always manage that, but certainly the person standing up at the front and giving the presentations about how to use MPI, taking you through it, stuff like that, software carpentry style as well. Has anybody done software carpentry? No, okay, it's something else. So that's a very interactive way of teaching. But all that was done by women, and then the people going around the room, and when somebody sticks their hand up and says, I have no idea what's going on here, we tried to make them predominantly female because that seems to have an impact on how likely people are to put up their hand. We also looked at the material content. Do we use gendered analogies, metaphors, and stuff like that? So we would have pictures of stick men, and they were definitely stick men, most definitely male, not female, right? And nobody ever really picked up on this before. But we were using pictures of stick men sending letters in a post box to talk about asynchronous communication. You send it, you don't know if it's arrived, stuff like this. Faxes and picking up a telephone for synchronous communication, all these analogies. We were using gendered examples, and every single one of them was male. I've heard plenty of people, not just my colleagues, but plenty of people who do training who use he and she to refer to things. And predominantly he when it comes to hardware. And this all just has a very underlying impact on people. And it seems trivial, but it all adds up and comes into unconscious bias. So we looked at all this. The results were eye-opening. These are some of the feedback comments we got. I think that a lot of the ladies attending were overqualified for this course. Many of them seemed to already have quite a lot of experience in HPC and were therefore beyond needing an introduction. It was less intimidating signing up to this course knowing it would be mostly women. I really appreciate that this course was for women. It allowed us to interact in a more relaxed environment. The fact that it was aimed at women meant that there was less pressured and competitive environment. I felt less embarrassed to be stuck or confused as everyone was so kind. But there was a negative. The experience that they had was intimidating, and at times I felt that people were talking shop and using jargon that I didn't understand, so I felt left out of some of the conversations happening during breaks. That last comment is particularly telling, given the first comment and anecdotal stories that were told to me over coffee, women coming up to me and said, I know everything you told me, and yet I was too scared to sign up before. That happened over and over again. Every single time I hear that, my heart breaks. Why are these women not signing up for this training? They should be going to the next level, right? And what happened is it meant that I sped up the training, and we were all talking jargon, and so the one woman in the room, or maybe two or three, who actually did need it at that level, were left in the dark. So you can see here, there is a real place for this kind of training. I should point out, we never, ever exclude men coming, because in the UK, you're not allowed to do that. This is free training. We can brand it as women in HPC, but we're not allowed to exclude men from this. That would be positive discrimination, which is illegal. So we always had one or two men in the room. And the interesting thing about those men is they came up to me as well and were saying things like, this was a very different experience to all the other training I've been in. And I will say, as a trainer, and somebody very skeptical going into it, my God, I love training women now. As somebody who's always taught groups of men before, sometimes only men, I found that they listen more to me. I felt that I didn't get as many people questioning my authority for standing at the front of the room and talking about MPI. That's, again, I can't quantify that. I have no quantification for that, but it is just an incredibly different experience. So what else can we do? What else can we do to address recruitment and retention? Unconscious bias. Now, I cannot tell you what you need to know about unconscious bias. Hopefully, what I can tell you is that you need to go away and find out more about it. The effect of unconscious bias is that the impact of our pre-existing beliefs and attitudes towards particular groups impacts how we actually interact with them. So everything we do in life, every single thing we do in life builds up an expectation of what we should see and what we should do, right? And this impacts us in terms of a human population as well. If we have only ever seen male computer scientists, we expect a computer scientist to be male, right? And it doesn't matter who you are. Being a female does not exclude you from that. I might be a female HPC person, but that doesn't mean that I believe any different on this unconscious level than my male colleagues. It's very problematic in workplaces when you're dominated by a single gender or group. So I should point out, the classic problem is men can't be nurses. That is unconscious bias too. Primary school, nursery school teachers, predominantly female. I had a male friend who was a nursery school teacher. He had to quit because the number of complaints that were made against him was sky high, and every single one, he was vindicated, but it just became emotionally draining to him. So it works in every single workforce where there's some sort of split. It's not unique to us. It inadvertently disadvantages those who are in an underrepresented group. So you're less likely to listen to people or listen to their ideas if they're in an underrepresented group. Again, I'm not blaming you, it's just how we are as human beings, okay? You're less likely to appoint them if they're not what you expect. You're less likely to offer them pay rises, less likely to offer them mentorship, sponsorship of an idea. So how do you address that? Well, first things first, learn more about it. I've just given you like 30-second introduction to it. You have to go on a day-long course. You really do. Go and find out more about it. This is really complex. Psychologists have been talking about this for 50 years, and yet the STEM community has only caught on in the last 5. We're so behind the curve here, and we have a lot to learn and pick up very quickly, because it really does impact everything we do. Be wary of poor training. There is mounting evidence, since unconscious bias, implicit bias has become a bit of a buzzword. Everybody's trying to provide training. There is mounting evidence that some training actually makes us more biased. We go into the room, we do the training, and then we walk out thinking, I'm fixed. You are never fixed. It never goes away. It does not go away. What you can do is learn about it, learn about where your biases kick in, and hopefully adjust for it. So learn about your biases. Go to Project Implicit. Who's heard of Project Implicit? Yeah, okay. Google it. It's amazing. It's written by Harvard. You can do some little tests. You can choose to submit the results so you can contribute to Harvard's research, which I strongly encourage you do. But go and find out where you're biased. The fascinating thing to me was when I started looking at this, I did it on the same day. I did it in the morning and in the evening. And I was more biased against women in the evening after a day at work, surrounded by men and being tired. I was just shocked and appalled. The moral of that story being, make sure you do interviews at the beginning of the day. Make sure you read resumes at the beginning of the day. Wherever possible, remove gender from the equation. Double blind is essential, in my opinion. There is big debates going on in the conference community about whether this is viable or not. Supercomputing has implemented double blind for a 5-year trial. They're on the 2nd year this year. It looks to be a positive experiment. It is hard to do, but just because it's hard doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. So double blind, whenever you look at resumes or applications for promotions or anything like that, do you need to know their gender until late on? If you can possibly remove their gender and their name, you should do. You should do. You do not need to know that in order to be able to make a sensible decision on whether this person is appropriate or not. There's always the caveat that I can figure out who that person is. What we actually find is quite a lot of the time we get that wrong. Unless you work immediately with somebody, we quite often make wrong assumptions about who that person is. So, stereotypes and impostors. Who's heard of stereotype threat? Who's heard of imposter syndrome? Okay, more. Okay. So, stereotypes. Stereotype, the first stereotype children learn is gender, right? By 8 years old, that is fixed in there. Mum does the housework, dad goes and earns money. It's the first stereotype human beings learn. That is so depressing to me. It just means it's so embedded in everything society does. Stereotype threat is where the concept of a stereotype impacts a person's performance. There's quite a lot of studies done on this. African American men being asked to do a maths test, and they're reminded before the maths test that they're in a minority group and their performance plummets, right? So the whole point here is it invokes some sort of anxiety that you are going to confirm a negative stereotype. This can even occur when you make a positive statement, such as, great job, of course women can do HPC, you're the best example of it. You're going to walk away and think, oh my God, if I don't do well, that's it. I'm encouraging this stereotype. So saying these comments, right, when you emphasize even trying to counteract the stereotype can actually reduce somebody's performance, and significantly so, hugely. In fact, the reasons for why this happens are quite complex, but the key thing is it drops your confidence. You're less likely to take risks because you're so averse to doing anything that might impact your performance. And we know that risk-taking in moderation actually is a good thing. And this all just comes down to lower performance. It actually has a appreciable impact on your IQ. The other one is imposter syndrome. So I wish I was told about this when I was 20 years old. I have spent my entire life thinking I don't belong here, thinking I shouldn't be here. I mean, okay, right now, I'm a physicist who dabbles in HPC, who is talking about social sciences, to a room full of people who probably know more HPC than me. Certainly the social scientists in the room definitely know more social science than me. And why on earth am I here? Why on earth should you listen to me? Right? That is how I feel when I do these talks. I felt like that my entire life. I felt like the only reason I got into my physics program was because I was a woman. because somebody said to me when I was in school, oh, they'll take you because I need to improve the proportion of women. Nothing to do with my grades. I feel like I only got my job because I was really good at like talking fast in my interview. And this is common. 70% of people will feel like a fraud at some point in their careers. This is normal, right? It's very, very common in high achieving areas such as academia. High performance computing fits right in there. And the key thing is everybody, more or less everybody, is experiencing it, but nobody talks about it. Have you ever heard somebody stand up in a seminar and say, by the way, I don't think I should be here? Like I just did, right? I don't think I should be here. Because you can't, because then you aren't going to take me seriously. Yeah? But we do need to recognize this is a thing, because otherwise we're going to have people going through their careers feeling like this all the time. And eventually they just go, you know what, I'm done. I'm walking away from this career path. I'm going to go and change. I do something else. So this, if we can talk about this, if we can say, you're not the only one that feels that way, I do too. It's okay. We can have a huge impact on retention. The other big one is how to count. So I used to go around saying, please go count for me, go and find out how many users you have that are female. Is there a difference between how many of your women who are registered users and how many of your men that are registered users are actually using available CPU hours and things like this? And then people would come back to me, they email me really enthusiastic, yes, I'm going to count. And then they're like, how do I do that? Turns out it's actually quite complex. So do's and don'ts. Do ask. You cannot guess on their behalf. Just because I think you're female doesn't mean that you are, okay? Also, you have a right to say, you have no right to ask that of me. So I always say, I'll ask a question, please identify your gender, something like that. Different countries have preferred wordings. And I make it compulsory because otherwise nobody answers it. It's one of those things at the bottom of the form that I don't have time to do. Why are you asking it? I don't know. Just go skip that question. I make it compulsory, but you must give them an option to not declare. So I offer 4 options: female, male, prefer not to say, and other, because gender is no longer binary. Now, prefer not to say and other generally are tiny proportions of the people that come in, but they have a right to say that. So let them self-declare. Do not look down the list of colleagues you have and go male, female, male, female, female, male, male, male. No, you can't do that. So don't assume. Do offer an opt-out. If you're going to share it with me, which I ask that you do, so we can build a global picture of the number of women in HPC. That doesn't mean I'm going to put NCAR up on a screen and say NCAR is terrible or NCAR is great. It means that we can put together a global picture. But I would therefore love to know just your numbers as well as your percentages. So I want it anonymized, but just give me a percentage. I don't know what that refers to. How many people do you have? And I can't then put together a clear picture internationally. What to measure? The gender of you and your colleagues, anybody who's got anything to do with HPC, right? This includes actually other aspects of HPC, like HPC marketing. They are still working in HPC. Now, it's nice to have a breakdown of the sectors, but for example, if all the women in supercomputing are actually from marketing, we've identified part of our problem. So we need that breakdown. HPC users, you run some amazing services here. I'd love to know who your users are, or not their names, but I'd love to know their gender. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, I'd love to know who's active and who's not. So one of the things we're seeing is, although 45% of biologists in the UK are female, we're getting very few biologists coming onto our HPC systems. So it's useful to understand their background. It's also useful from the point of view of, one of my hypotheses is that PhD students are offered quite often multiple options at the beginning of PhD. This is what happened to me anyway. You can use HPC, you can use this, you can do some experiments as well, and they try everything out during their first year. So they'll get an account on an HPC service, courtesy of their PI, their advisor, but the question is, do they continue to use it? Is the rate of continuation different from males and females? I'd love to understand that better. Are they engaged? Who's inactive? Who's active? And who are they? Are they co-Is, PIs, advisors, researchers, students? Some of this may require you to put in some changes to your registration systems, which we've had to do. We've gone through, we've not just added gender, we've added scientific area as well, because one of the things we're trying to understand from a procurement point of view is where are the people coming from? Which departments are they embedded in? Do they class themselves as chemists, biologists? I know for NCAR, maybe that's different. Maybe everybody you expect to be climate scientists, but maybe that's not true. Have you ever checked? And if you can, publication rates. So this is something we've recently done from just a funding and impact point of view. We added in, please let us know if you publish research and the name of the paper if you've used our service to do so. We asked them to put in acknowledgement, which they often don't do, but we also asked them to let us know that they've done this through our registration system. And so one of the things we're going to look at when we've got enough data moving forward is to see if there's a difference in publication rates. So what can you do other than counting? Look at the gender dimension. Who's heard of Stanford Gendered Innovations? No. So gender dimension is a big thing in Europe because a lot of our funding comes from the European Research Council. And Horizon 2020, the current funding program, has a gender dimension. This comes out of the Stanford Gendered Innovations project because, for example, Google Translate. Who's used Google Translate? Like everybody, right? Most of us. When Google Translate turned on, overnight, the internet eradicated 60 years of progress of recognizing women by the use of he and by the use of she rather than he in text. It eradicated 60 years of progress overnight because Google Translate only used male pronouns. So we'd have person X, who happened to be a female name, he did, as soon as you put it through Google Translate. And there are lots of possible reasons why this happened. But the point is nobody had even considered it. Nobody. Nobody in the team, of which there are a huge number of people working on this, right? Nobody had considered this. So the gender dimension requires, in Horizon 2020 anyway, that you consider how does your work impact both genders. This is a huge impact on medical sciences where there are drugs that go to market which have never been tested on women. And there are a few disturbing cases where they've either had to be removed from the market once they actually get to being used on women, because women have hormones. It's just terrible, don't you know? You can't possibly test drugs on women. By the way, men have hormones too, I'd like to point out. But it was viewed that it was difficult to test drugs on women, and including female mice and things like that as well. And more to the point, they never even recorded it. So you didn't actually know whether it had been tested on female mice, male mice. It was just mice. And we know that men and women have different immune responses. And actually, there are some drugs we now have to massively change the dosage rate for men and women. That's biology. Let's deal with it. So it's really obvious over there. But it does impact what we do. Google Translate should tell you it impacts what we do, right? Some of the time, it's really hard to figure out how what we do impacts humans. But training does. And I know you guys do training. As I've shown you, actually, training experience can have a huge impact on what goes on further on in somebody's career. Provide mentorship and sponsorship. This is a big one. Mentoring programs we know are needed by women. If you're in an underrepresented group, you're more likely to benefit from mentorship, and yet you're less likely to be offered it. So providing a formal mentorship program is a really good starting point. And then sponsorship. Women who are offered sponsorship, this is where you have somebody advocating for you. They're more likely to progress. They're more likely to have their ideas listened to. They're something like 200%, not 200 times, 200% more likely to have their idea taken to market if they have a sponsor than if they don't. So having an advocate is a really big one. Look at your family-friendly working policies. Do you have such a thing? If you do, are they really family-friendly? Have you actually asked your staff discreetly, not like in a public forum. Please put up your hand if you think it's family friendly. I'll better put up my hand then, because I want to go home today at 4 o'clock to look after my child. Have you actually asked whether or not your family friendly policies really are? And by the way, that impacts men too. The more men we can get taking care of children, the more likely we are to change the perception that it's the woman's job. And actually the ideal world would be, it's just the best parent for the job. To be brutally honest, if I have children, I will be a terrible mother, and I'm going to have to convince my husband to be the stay-at-home one, because otherwise the kids aren't going to turn out very well. So we need to change the perception that it's the women's job. But I'll also point out that although the UK does really great things for maternity leave and maternity care, and we've recently introduced paternity leave, so once you go beyond 3 months, either the man or the woman can take the leave. One of you has to go back to work, but one of you can't. But so there's a mandatory minimum salary for when you're on leave for a woman, maternity leave. For men, there is no such thing. The University of Edinburgh, where I work, which is amazing for maternity, will give me 6 months full pay. Fantastic. They don't offer any coverage for men. So given that my husband and I both work in the same place, we would be mad for my husband to be the one doing the stay-at-home work financially. Now, I will point out that that is not uncommon. I'm not saying the university is bad. I think they're fantastic for doing what they do for women, but we need to make it equal. I know that some things can't be equal until we manage to convince men that they can give birth, biologically as well as mentally, but we're a bit away from that still. But there is still more that we can do. I'd please advocate, of course I will, because there's a selling point. I come along to women in HPC events. I have skimmed the surface of what we're doing, really have, but there's so much more. And send your women along. These are also career skills building events. Our workshop at Supercomputing in Denver in November will have half a day on skills to thrive for women. Men are welcome to come, and it's very good for them too, but it's targeting women. So send them along. Run your own events. I will even offer you some resources on how to do that. Please run your own events. I know not everybody can go to Supercomputing as much as everybody should, because it's awesome. These can be involved, like speed mentoring, hold social events. Maybe you have women who are spread out all around your campus who never realized that they're all doing the same thing. Get them together, get them to meet each other. Invite female keynote speakers, and not just ones to talk about diversity. I feel like I'm definitely the person that goes and talks diversity, and actually it should be a man standing up here just to change your stereotyping there. But get female technical keynotes to come, and sometimes that's really hard. Having run a couple of conferences myself, and we're like, okay, we need women, right? That's on my agenda. And yet coming up with those names is tricky, but persevere. And then look at how you run them as well. Are you offering something that's family friendly? Can you offer childcare? I know there's a cost to that, but can you? Can you offer a parents' room? Can you offer a prayer room? Let's go beyond gender. So beyond gender is my final thing. I'm going to wrap up really quickly. Thank you for your patience here. There are 2 things I want to draw your attention to that I'm also involved in to do with diversity. The ARCHER Outreach Project, which helps fund women in HPC, does way more than just women in HPC. It's called Outreach because we do go into schools and we go and talk to children, and we develop outreach materials that you can actually go and download from our website and use yourself to do with HPC, how to communicate HPC to little children. But the big one is we realize that looking at just gender isn't enough. I'll admit that it's something dear to my heart. It's also a relatively easy target, but there are many underrepresented groups. So we've put together a couple of best practice guides, conferences, how to run a conference that's as welcoming as possible, and also in training, how to ensure your training is accessible to everybody. This covers from disabilities all the way through to gender. And then there's a Faces of HPC project that I've put together where we're doing interviews and biographies of people. The biographies tend to be more just computing, but exceptional leading figures such as Katherine Johnson. But we also do interviews with people in HPC, and this is men and women, and they talk about any aspect of diversity they want to. So at the bottom there, you've got my colleague Gavin Pringle, who's openly gay, and he has found that a challenge in HPC. And this is demonstrating, hopefully, that, you know what, everybody's different, and that is something to embrace. And just because what you see is not necessarily what's going on underneath. I think it's a really important thing to emphasize. The other thing is, as was mentioned at the beginning, I am the inclusivity chair for the Supercomputing conference this year. And that's all about embedding inclusivity. So it's not just diversity. Last year we called it diversity. We recognize that's not enough. Because diversity, people will go, but I don't want to feel excluded. I'm not underrepresented, but you're excluding me. So it's about making it a good experience for everybody. So double-blind reviewing has been brought in, and we're going to do an analysis of that. We've brought back the prayer room for people from different faiths. We have a child policy now, which clearly outlines how you can bring children to the conference, and clear guidelines here, because we recognize that people would ask and we'd maybe say yes, and other times they get inconsistent advice. So you can bring a baby under 6 months to the conference, and it can go around with you. If they're over 6 months, we ask them to be in childcare, but we are providing childcare. And there is a parents' room for men and women, where there are private areas for breastfeeding and for pumping, but there's also places just to change the baby and have a quiet space away from the craziness of the SC week with your child. And we're also looking into our attendees, and this is, again, comes back to why my work with women in HPC is so important, because if we don't understand, we can't fix it. So we're not just benchmarking how many women there are and how many people from different minority groups there are. We're also looking at those who don't return. Why didn't they come back? Are they still in HPC? Have they left HPC? Why have they left HPC? We're also looking at experiences and expectations. What is the expectation of people coming to SC? Is it what they think it is? Is that a good experience? Is it a bad experience? Is there a difference between different groups here? So one of the questions we asked in the SC16 attendee survey was, did they experience discrimination? And there is a gender difference again. So we need to look at that in more detail and figure out if there's something that we as a conference can do about it. Some of these things may well be out of our control. We can't dictate how everybody behaves, although there is a code of conduct. So I would encourage you, if you go to SC and you see something unacceptable, please do get in touch, because there is a code of conduct for the conference. But again, supercomputing as a conference has a potential to have a huge impact on this. It's the single largest HPC conference in the world. And it isn't just US attendees. You know, I'm one of the organizers and I'm from the UK. So it is huge potential for influence here and education on this topic. So in summary, what I'd like you to take away from this is you can't just look at one or the other. You have to look at recruitment and retention, and not just gender either. And both of those things will improve diversity. I'd just like to thank two of my colleagues, Athena Franzana, my PhD student, who's looking at the research behind women in HPC, and Lorna Rivera from Georgia Tech, who's done a lot of the work on the summer school with me, as well as funders and the International HPC Summer School, PRACE, ARCHER, and my funding council, EPSRC. Thank you. I really appreciate you letting me come and speak to you here today about this. It's a topic very dear to my heart. So thank you very much. And once we've finished recording, I'm happy to take questions.